kick off our discussions today, we're going to have a plenary session on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The convention defines the rights and responsibilities of nations to use the world's oceans, including navigation rights, fisheries regulation, and management of marine natural resources, among other issues. The convention was open for signature 30 years ago, but the United States remains the only major industrialized nation to have not ratified the treaty. This morning's speakers will discuss the impacts of this convention on our national security, our economic interests, including the benefits of claiming an extended continental shelf. We'll then take questions from the floor. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador David Balton, who will cover the background on the convention and where it stands today politically, period. He will also examine science and scientists' role in the convention. Ambassador Balton is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Oceans and Fisheries in the Department of State's Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science. He is responsible for coordinating the development of U.S. foreign policy concerning the oceans and fisheries, as well as foreign policy relating to the Arctic and the Antarctic. Ambassador Balton has functioned as the lead U.S. negotiator on a wide range of agreements in the field of oceans and fisheries, and from 2009 through 2010, he co-chaired the Arctic Council Task Force in negotiations for an agreement on cooperation in aeronautical and maritime search and rescue in the Arctic. Previously, he served for 6 years as Director of the Office of Marine Conservation in the Department of State. Would you please welcome Dr. David Balton?
Thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate the American Geophysical Union for pulling together this timely conference. I'd like to thank them for inviting me here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So the plenary topic is the Convention on the Law of the Sea, a topic near and dear to my heart. Yes, I will speak a little bit about the history of the convention and where it stands today, but my primary purpose here is to focus on one part of the convention only, the part relating to the continental shelf. There's a lot to say about that, but I think for this crowd, perhaps the most interesting part will be about the role of science and scientists here in the United States as we try to define the extent of our continental shelf. And if you'd like to learn more about this topic, there are a number of great posters that have been prepared sitting outside. So here we have the Convention on the Law of the Sea. You know, among the vast majority of nations in the world, this treaty is a well-accepted staple of international law with a long and noble lineage. But here in the United States, the convention has had a contentious history and still, amazingly to me, faces an uncertain future. The treaty was negotiated over the course of many administrations, started in the Nixon administration, Ford, Carter. A part of it was renegotiated beginning under the first President Bush and President Clinton. It has been sitting in its current form before the United States Senate since the mid-90s. Twice during the administration of the second President Bush, the administration persuaded the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to take up the treaty. Twice that committee voted favorably on the treaty in 2004 and again in 2007. But neither time did the full Senate vote on the treaty. Now we have yet another administration, the Obama administration. It took a look at the same suite of issues related to this treaty, came to the same conclusion. The United States needs to join. And once again, it is before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the committee has a chance this year to consider the convention again, and my hope is that the third time will be a charm. There is certainly no dearth of supporters. The entire U.S. military establishment, now and for many years, has supported the U.S. joining the convention, primarily because of the provisions of the treaty that guarantee freedom of navigation on, under, and over the world's oceans. All major U.S. industries that work in the ocean, the oil and gas industry, telecommunications industry, shipping industries, and others support the U.S. joining. Why? Because the treaty gives the United States great access to the economics that the oceans provide. U.S. labor unions, U.S. environmental groups, U.S. rule of law type people, think tanks, support it as well. So it is my hope that with this very broad, I would say unusually broad coalition of support, this time the Senate will in fact approve the treaty. There are many reasons to do so, but the one I'll focus on has to do with the continental shelf. Only, this is a takeaway message, only by joining the convention can the United States maximize legal certainty and have the best path to securing international recognition of our continental shelf. So, those of you who know something about the convention may recognize this diagram, and believe me, I'm not going through all of it. But the short version is that the treaty sets up a series of zones in the ocean. With respect to the water column, there are the zones, the territorial sea that can extend 12 nautical miles from shore, a contiguous zone that can stretch to 24 nautical miles beyond the territorial sea, an exclusive economic zone that can go out to a maximum of 200 miles, and beyond that, an area of the high seas where no nation has exclusive jurisdiction. None of those are particularly relevant to the continental shelf. There, it's a little bit simpler. Here's a greatly simplified version of that same diagram relating only to the land under the ocean. The way the treaty works, if you're a nation with a coastline, you automatically get the first 200 miles of seafloor off your coast as your continental shelf, regardless of what the shelf looks like, regardless of what it's made of. And then, if the area beyond 200 miles from your shore meets certain criteria, you get that too. We generally refer to this area beyond 200 miles from shore as the extended continental shelf, or ECS. So how do you figure out how far your continental shelf can extend? I am not going to go through the hour-long version of this, and there are plenty of people in this room who can do so better than I in any event. The short, oversimplified version goes like this. First, you need to find the foot of the slope. The foot of the slope, generally speaking, is that point at the base of the slope with the maximum, where you find the maximum change of gradient. And once you find that point, you have two options. You can either go out 60 nautical miles and stop there, or if you have a lot of sediment, you can go out to a point that may be farther seaward, where the thickness of the sediment is 1% of the distance back to the foot of the slope. Sounds simple, right? There'll be a quiz afterwards. If you're a nation with potential coastline, or potential shelf beyond 200 miles, you can use either of these formula to maximize your shelf. But you can't get too greedy. The convention also imposes a couple of different types of limits or cutoffs or constraints. One is simple. You can't go more than 350 miles from shore. Unless, if you find the 2,500 meter isobath and add 100 miles, if that point is farther, you can go out that far too. There are some other bells and whistles, but just to sum up, to give you an idea, every nation with a coastline automatically gets the first 200 miles as continental shelf. If you're a lucky nation, you can get a continental shelf beyond 200 miles using either of these two formula for extending and subject to either of these two cutoff lines. And if you're a truly lucky nation, truly lucky, like, say, the United States, you can claim a continental shelf that extends over vast areas of seafloor in a wide range of areas pertinent to your coast. Why the heck does this matter? You might be wondering at this point. The coastal nation gets exclusive rights to all of the resources on and under the shelf. Think oil, gas, minerals, rare earth elements. There are also a set of critters, sedentary species, that live on the shelf, essentially permanently, those two become part of the coastal nation's exclusive rights throughout the full extent of the continental shelf. And whether you think we need to drill, baby, drill and exploit all resources to the maximum, or whether you're at the opposite end of the spectrum and all you want to do is conserve and protect the resources in these areas, I think everyone can agree that being the nation to get to make that decision, or some decision in between, matters a lot. So coming back to the Law of the Sea Convention, if you're a nation, a lucky nation, with potentially large areas of extended continental shelf, how do you get other nations to recognize your claims to that shelf? If you are a party to the Law of the Sea Treaty, you have a process. You can submit data in support of your claim to continental shelf to a group of experts, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. They are not a court, but they are empowered to review your claim, make recommendations back to you as the nation. And if, as the nation, you finalize the outer limits of your shelf in accordance with those recommendations, then your outer limits are final and binding. It doesn't get much better than that. And indeed, there are lots of countries well engaged in this process. Potentially 80 nations have the possibility of claiming continental shelf beyond 200 miles. Here's a map that shows in orange the areas that have been subject to submissions to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. The map doesn't actually capture as fully as I might like the claim by Russia, which extends over a very large area of the Arctic seafloor. Indeed, Russia was the very first country to make a claim to this submission. But the United States is not a party to this convention. We are very much on the outside of this process looking in. That is a very serious disadvantage. We are nevertheless working hard to figure out how far out our continental shelf extends in accordance with these various criteria and cutoff lines. In 2007, our government formed the Extended Continental Shelf Project, or the task force that's carrying out this project. You can see a whole bunch of the agencies of the U.S. government involved in this. More than a dozen agencies. And this map shows in pink the areas off our coasts where we believe we have extended continental shelf to claim. There are many. The largest single one is almost certain to be in the Arctic north of Alaska, but also in the Bering Sea, possibly in areas south of the Aleutians, possibly off the west coast, off our Pacific Island territories, 2 areas in the Gulf of Mexico, and off the Atlantic seabed. Off the Atlantic coast. All told, the areas in which we may be able to claim continental shelf beyond 200 miles, just the part beyond 200 miles, could be half the size of the Louisiana Purchase, twice the size of the state of California. Those are very conservative estimates. Could be even twice that or more. We don't actually know yet how far out the continental shelf extends. How do you go about figuring this out? Well, here's where we get to the role of science and scientists. There are two basic types of data you need in support of your claim to continental shelf beyond 200 miles. One is you need to know the shape, the morphology of the seafloor, and for that you basically need bathymetry, bathymetric data. And then you'll recall that one of the formula lines involves knowing thickness of sediment. In order to determine that, you need seismic data. And we have been gathering these types of data and others for quite some time, even before the ECS task force was created. Since 2003, there have been 33 cruises to acquire bathymetric and seismic data in 9 different regions off the U.S. coast. We've also begun the massive project of collecting, storing, and analyzing this data in hopes that we will be able to make a submission to the Continental Shelf Commission soon in support of our claim to continental shelf. The Arctic has been one particular area of interest. Obviously, that is the piece, as I said, where we're likely to have the largest piece of shelf. We've conducted 8 total cruises aboard the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Healy in the Arctic. 4 of those cruises were done in tandem with the Canadian government and its vessel, the Louis Saint Laurent. So far in the Arctic alone, we have mapped an area of seafloor larger than the state of Montana. We've collected enough seismic data. If you add the lines together, they would cross the United States 4 times. The Healy and the Louis Saint Laurent gave us a powerful symbol of international cooperation as well. At some points in the joint cruises, the Healy would lead, it would cut a path through the ice. The Louis would follow, collecting seismic data using a type of gear some of you may be familiar with off its stern. And then when we needed bathymetry, the ships would typically reverse position. The Louis would break ice, and the Healy would collect the bathymetry. Both nations share the data equally. A lot of science gets done along the way that is only, I would say, indirectly related to finding out the limits of the continental shelf. There are all sorts of corollary benefits that come beyond simply providing symbols of international cooperation through our work with Canada. Some of this research has yielded amazing finds in areas of the ocean, areas of the seafloor that were previously unexplored, inaccessible. Academic institutions have worked with our agencies and the government to do this. Scientists have been able to collect some truly unique data to give better understanding of climate change, marine ecosystems, hazards. The data from the Arctic, for example, revealed scours created by past glaciers and icebergs scraping along the seafloor, large craters in the seafloor thought to be formed by gas seeps emanating from the ocean floor. The 2010 Arctic cruise yielded some of the first direct evidence for gas hydrates in that region. Scientists from the National Ice Center have also been deploying these buoys on the ice in connection with these cruises to track the movement of Arctic ice. Discovered a seamount along the way, probably more than one. This is the Healy seamount, discovered in 2007 in the course of the mapping of the Arctic seafloor. It rises more than 3,000 meters from the seafloor. Didn't know it was there before we came upon it. Here you see how geologists are finally getting the seismic data necessary to unlock the secrets of how the Arctic Ocean basins and features were formed. This diagram shows a comparison of the seismic data that we held in 2006, most of which was fairly close to shore, compared to the data that we've collected in cooperation with Canada through 2010. We've done similar data collection of seismology in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska as part of our project. Here's another cool example. The NOAA's ship, the Okeanos Explorer, was able to collect data in 2009 that created the image you see here in the water column. Scientists suspect that this methane plume is emanating from a large crater on the sea floor. If you've gone on Google Earth recently and checked out the bathymetry off the Atlantic coast, most of that was supplied by us, those of us who have been gathering the data as part of the Extended Continental Shelf Project. Off the Northern Mariana Islands, NOAA has mapped a series of guyots. These are the sort of so-called flat-top seamounts. And there are also some pinnacles out there, some of which almost touch the ocean surface. Half a dozen come within less than 20 meters. You might have read recently that the Challenger Deep has been mapped. The mapping was done on an ECS cruise by NOAA in conjunction with the University of New Hampshire. So where are we now in this? Well, we're coming up to a major turning point in this project. We are almost done with the major data collection. Probably over the next year or two, 3 at the most, we will have finished all the cruises and will be very much in the process of pulling it all together, figuring out what all the data really means, matching it up with the criteria of the Law of the Sea Convention, recommendations that the Commission has already given to other states, and making the best case we can for the U.S. Extended Continental Shelf. This is no mean feat. Down here you can see, hope you can see, This is the supporting documentation that Australia sent to the Commission relating to its claim to continental shelf. It's a lot of material. But of course, until and unless the Senate approves the Law of the Sea Convention, we are at a disadvantage. It's not at all clear how the Commission on the Continental Shelf would react to a submission by the United States as a non-party. We will not have a clear path forward as a non-party to gain the full benefits of what will be a continental shelf likely to be the envy of most every other country in the world. Thanks very much for your attention. I think we're going to save questions until after Admiral Kenney's presentation.
Okay, so our second speaker is Rear Admiral Frederick Kenney, who will be talking to us about the Coast Guard's interest in the convention and how it will protect the U.S. economy, navigation safety, and national security. He will also discuss how the convention will bolster the U.S.'s role in the International Maritime Organization, which is a United Nations agency responsible for shipping safety, security, and maritime pollution prevention. Rear Admiral Kenney serves as Judge Advocate General and Chief Counsel for the United States Coast Guard, where he is responsible for the delivery of all legal services in support of the Coast Guard's missions, units, and people. He was commissioned in 1981 after graduating from Officer Candidate School. Some of Rear Admiral Kenney's other legal assignments include duty as Chief of the Office of Maritime and International Law in Washington, D.C., where he was the head of the United States delegation to the International Maritime Organization's Legal Committee and an appellate judge on the Coast Guard Court of Criminal Appeals. His list of operational assignments also includes service as commanding officer of the Coast Guard Pacific Area Tactical Law Enforcement Team in San Diego, California, and of the Coast Guard Law Enforcement Detachment in Alameda, California. Please welcome Rear Admiral Kenney to the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all here. I know it's early, and the size of this crowd is really heartwarming to me. I wanted to thank first the AGU for this really welcome opportunity to talk to you about the law of the sea. Ambassador Balton and I were talking last week, and this really does present a tremendous opportunity for us to inform, educate you, and also get your point of view regarding the convention. And I also wanted to thank you for that really warm introduction. Ambassador Balton led off with probably the sexy stuff for you, the scientific aspects of why we need to join. I will be talking about why the military, including the U.S. Coast Guard, needs this convention, and we need it now. Maybe not as sexy to this crowd, but I think equally important to the interests of the United States. I do not have PowerPoint slides. I'm actually kind of an anti-PowerPoint person. They say there's that old saying that an army moves on its stomach. I think today it's the armed forces move on PowerPoint, so I tend to reject that and avoid it where I can. So you'll just have to listen to me talk. The United States Navy, the United States Coast Guard, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been steadfast and firm in their support for accession to the law of the sea. It's consistent, it's long-standing. Every Chief of Naval Operations for the last 20 years, every Commandant of the Coast Guard for the last 20 years, and several Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been very outspoken in their support of the convention. General Dempsey, the current Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Greener, the current Chief of Naval Operations, and Admiral Papp, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, have been both outspoken and steadfast in describing the military's need to accede to this convention now. I actually find it quite humorous when I hear talking heads in the media say, the Navy and the Coast Guard don't need the law of the sea, when Admiral Papp and Admiral Greener will tell you that we do. Well, who are you going to believe? Because the United States is the world's foremost maritime power, our security interests are intrinsically linked to freedom of navigation. The Navy and the Coast Guard have to be able to move freely across the seas worldwide in order to preserve our national security interests. We have more to gain from the legal certainty that the law of the sea provides than any other country. We need the substantive rules that ensure worldwide access for military and commercial ships and aircraft. It's vital to our security interests. It's also vital to our economy. 95% of all imports and exports to and from the United States are carried by water at some point in the supply chain. 90% of those goods are carried on foreign flagged vessels coming into and out of U.S. ports. The law of the sea provides the rules for that transportation system, and us being outside hurts us, and I'll describe that a little more later. The Navigational Bill of Rights, as we like to call it, enshrined in the Convention, provides worldwide mobility and during wartime, including during wartime, all without the permission of other countries. It is a terrific deal for the United States, and it squarely aligns with our long-term strategic interests. Among other things, it sets forth the maximum navigational rights and freedoms for our ships and aircraft in the exclusive economic zone, as Ambassador Balton described, and on the high seas. For the Navy, it accords their submarines the critical right to transit submerged through international straits. Why is accession to the current law of the sea convention important in that regard? Well, there's two reasons. The first one is the U.S. is currently party to the 1958 conventions on the high seas and the territorial seas. Those conventions are imperfect. They do not have the full suite of navigational rights that are contained in the law of the sea. And critics who say that we can just continue to rely on those conventions really miss the point, because we do have additional freedom, navigational freedoms that are granted in the Law of the Sea Convention. The Law of the Sea Convention, the other argument that's made is that we can simply rely on customary international law. Well, customary international law changes over time, and it changes really beyond our control. In addition, when you have a treaty that is as widely accepted as the law of the sea, 161 nations and the EU are parties to the Law of the Sea Convention, I have a question: what is customary international law when you have a treaty that's so widely accepted? I would submit that customary international law is the law of the sea, and we are on the outside looking in if we are not a party. I'm going to shift here a little bit and talk about some of the practical reasons why it is in the U.S. and specifically the Coast Guard's interest to accede the convention. I talked about mobility. As I'm sure all of you know, the U.S. Navy operates around the globe. Many of you may not know that the Coast Guard operates around the globe as well. As I stand here speaking to you, there are Coast Guard cutters in the Caribbean. There are Coast Guard cutters in the Eastern Pacific, in the Western Pacific, in the Persian Gulf, and patrolling off the coast of Africa. Well, why? Let's just take the counter-drug mission and how we execute that mission, and how acceding to the law of the sea would lock in a favorable set of rules as treaty rights and give the U.S. greater legitimacy and credibility as we seek to hold others to the convention's terms. The Coast Guard's counter-drug mission is not very well known. The Coast Guard actually has 11 statutory missions. We sometimes say that we suffer from an identity crisis because people tend to look at the Coast Guard as a single service armed force. Some people think we're the people who come out and rescue you when your pleasure boat is sinking. Fishermen think we're the folks that enforce the fisheries rules. Drug smugglers think we're the people who arrest them and take them to jail. So what the Coast Guard does kind of depends on where you sit. I think today, a lot of people, 20 years ago, people thought they're the ones who come and rescue me when my boat's sinking. I think today, a lot of people think, well, the Coast Guard is the federal agency that comes in and manages major incidents when something goes horribly wrong at sea, such as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill or Hurricane Katrina. But we do an awful lot more than that. We regulate the entire maritime industry. We enforce all U.S. laws on the seas where we have jurisdiction. In the counter-drug scenario, we play the away game. The Coast Guard is usually far offshore trying to intercept drug smugglers in either the departure zone from the producing countries or in the transit zone as they are heading towards the United States or a third country for transportation of the narcotics through our borders, our land borders. The fact is that last year, the Coast Guard, working with the U.S. Navy and our joint interagency partners, seized more cocaine in the departure zones and transit zones than were seized by local law enforcement and Customs and Border Patrol on the southwest border combined, actually by a factor of almost 2. We get about twice as many interdictions far at sea. The reason that we are able to be so successful in that mission is because we have a very strong set of bilateral agreements with countries whose ships are normally flagged, carry the flag of drug smuggling vessels. And what it allows us to do is get on board those vessels, inspect them, seize them, and exercise U.S. jurisdiction over the people on board very quickly and efficiently. I'll give you a practical example of, and I should say that negotiating those bilateral agreements depends heavily on the provisions of the law of the sea, and it is more difficult for the U.S. to negotiate those bilateral agreements as a non-party. It invariably comes up during the negotiations. So why is it important? Why can't we just rely on customary international law? Can we live without these bilaterals? As you heard in my introduction, I have a law enforcement background. When I was a young officer, I was a boarding officer, and I was out there in the Eastern Pacific and in the Caribbean interdicting these drug smugglers. And this was before we had any bilateral agreements. What would happen is we would get on board, and if we found something, we had to then radio back into shore, get with the State Department, and then negotiate a case-by-case agreement on how the particular case would be disposed. That could sometimes take a long time. I boarded a Panamanian flag vessel that was loaded with marijuana. The master actually let us come aboard on a Friday afternoon. We knew we had them. The master knew he was caught, and so did the crew. We began the diplomatic process to seize the vessel and bring it in and prosecute the smugglers. Well, it was Friday afternoon and no one was home in Panama. And Monday was a national holiday in Panama. So I did not get permission to seize that vessel until Tuesday afternoon. So I spent from Friday till Tuesday on board that vessel. I could tell you that the smugglers were really not all that happy that we were there. And we could not enforce any law. We could only defend ourselves at that point. We now have a very robust bilateral agreement with Panama that allows us to process these cases very quickly. And it's not only the safety of the boarding personnel that's in question, but the Coast Guard, or the Navy ship in this case, that I was coming off of was sitting there for these 4 days when it could have been out on patrol looking for other smugglers. So joining the convention allows us to expand the scope of our bilateral agreements. It makes it easier to negotiate, and it keeps our patrol assets on scene and patrolling more effectively and more efficiently. Joining the convention maximizes U.S. influence in the different international organizations that take a role in interpreting, applying, and developing the law of the sea. The organization that I'm going to talk about here is the International Maritime Organization. As I mentioned earlier, shipping is an international endeavor. And in order for the commercial shipping industry to maximize its efficiency and effectiveness, and shipping is the cheapest form of transportation available, there has to be a standard set of rules for safety, security, and environmental protection. Those rules are negotiated at the International Maritime Organization, and the U.S. Coast Guard, by delegation from the State Department, leads the U.S. delegations to the IMO in negotiating these rules and standards. We are one of the very few members of the IMO who is not a party to the law of the sea, but we adhere to its principles, and we want to use the law of the sea when we're negotiating these instruments. It's challenging at the IMO being a non-party. I have had the somewhat uncomfortable experience of negotiating instruments there, and I have one very vivid memory of I was the chair of a drafting committee for one particular instrument. I was making my report to the plenary session with about 400 people in the room, and I mentioned that we were interpreting the Law of the Sea Convention in a particular way as it applied to this particular instrument that we're negotiating. The head of the delegation from another country asked for the floor and said, "Why should we listen to you? Your country isn't a party. Do you even have standing to speak?" And this happens to us quite frequently at the IMO. We need to be party to the convention so that we can negotiate on an equal footing with every other country over there. I talked about navigational freedoms. This is an increasingly important issue to the Navy and the Coast Guard around the world because we often are dealing with countries who have excessive navigational claims. Many of you may have heard of China's claims in the South China Sea, where they are claiming practically the entire South China Sea as their territorial waters. Of course, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia have something to say about that. They don't agree. The U.S. doesn't have a seat at the table. We can't argue that excessive claim as well as we could because of our non-party status. In the counter-drug arena, two of the countries that the Coast Guard deals with on a regular basis, Ecuador and El Salvador, have excessive maritime claims. Our non-party status to the law of the sea affects those negotiations when we are dealing with those countries in the counter-drug arena. Even our great neighbors, Canada, we have navigational disputes with them. Two that I'll mention is we have a dispute with Canada regarding access to the port of Eastport, Maine, for which any large ship coming in has to pass through Canadian waters in order to enter. You can only get about a 50-foot boat exclusively in U.S. waters into Eastport. There has been a proposal to put a liquefied natural gas terminal in Eastport. Canada has said it would deny entry to any LNG tanker attempting to come to Eastport. Canada's a party to the law of the sea. We are not. We cannot fully utilize the dispute resolution processes in the law of the sea because we are a non-party. We have another issue with Canada regarding their regulations for navigation in the Northwest Passage, which they claim is their internal waters. We believe it's an international strait. Again, difficult for us to negotiate because of our non-party status. Ambassador Balton talked about the Arctic and the potential for the United States to make a very large extended continental shelf. claim. How that practically impacts the Coast Guard is that the Coast Guard is the federal agency that is going to be tasked with executing the majority of the missions in the Arctic. The Navy certainly has a major stake up there, but when you look at things like search and rescue, oil spill response, navigation safety, waterways management, that is on the Coast Guard. And right now, we have very, very limited resources in the Arctic. The operating environment is extremely harsh. We have no land bases, permanent land bases on the North Slope of Alaska. And we are looking to increase our footprint up there as activity, particularly commercial activity, increases. You may have heard that Shell Oil has applied for permits to drill in the Arctic commencing this summer. Permits haven't been approved yet, but when they are, or if they are, things are likely to start happening up there very quickly. There will be a lot of commercial activity. There may be protest activity. The Coast Guard will be on the hook to ensure that those operations are conducted safely, securely, and with due regard to environmental protection. These involve resource decisions for the Coast Guard, which involves us creating our budget model to get those resources. If we only have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, or we have a 650 nautical mile extended continental shelf claim, that has significant resource impacts for the Coast Guard, but we can't plan until we know what that claim is going to be. And as Ambassador Balton said, it's going to be difficult for us to make that claim until we are a party to the law of the sea. So I hope I've given you a flavor of the practical aspects of why the military needs the law of the sea to better execute its missions, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.